Welcome to this year's TEDxTSIS virtual event. I am Zoe, and along with Adrian, we are the heads of this year's TEDx event. We're delighted to introduce to you the theme of this year's event, which is Conscience Rebooted. Our generation has irreversibly been changed with the invention of the internet and social media, and it has undeniably become an increasingly important tool that shapes our perception of the world. But what we define as morally correct or right is constantly wielded by the lenses of our conscience.
As such, the extent to which technology has renewed and hence rebooted our perspectives where needed can be reflected upon to construct lifelong takeaways. The consequence of this would not only better our comprehension of the world, but also the provision of new opportunities to form a more harmonious internal state.
Due to COVID-19, we're unable to meet you guys in real life. However, we're excited to introduce the 7 speakers to you virtually. To kick off the event, let us introduce the first speaker, Marco, and his speech, Do Reinvent the Wheel. Marco has done his fair share of both abstract mathematics and practical AI engineering across 3 continents. This has given him some insight into the kinds of problems that we tend to create for ourselves and how we might solve them and outright avoid them.
Through the lens of examining the less than ideal state of modern software, he will argue that don't reinvent the wheel is generally bad advice, and explain the benefits of focusing on problem solving over a just Google it approach, which is particularly important for young students as they navigate an increasingly complex technological world. So now, let us please welcome Marco.
When people say don't reinvent the wheel, they're giving what seems to be pretty sensible advice. Don't waste your time redoing something that somebody else already did before you perfectly. Well, let's talk about what a wheel is. If your objective is to transport things from point A to point B, then the wheel is kind of perfect. I mean, cars use them, bicycles use them, even airplanes use them. It really feels like if you were to spend your time researching the optimal way to transport things from point A to point B, you would ultimately just end up back at the wheel again. So I guess the idea is that you should really not spend your time reinventing a solution if the solution already exists. But what I hope to convince you of today is that most of the time when somebody tells you don't reinvent the wheel, it's usually going to be bad advice. And I say this for 2 reasons. The first reason is there is no wheel. What I mean by that is there simply isn't any one-size-fits-all ready-made solution that solves your specific problems. And the second reason I say this is because it shifts focus away from actually understanding your problem and moves it towards searching for ready-made solutions. This is especially true in the world of software. In today's world, most of the software is really bad. And I'm not just talking about the software written by a high school student the night before their assignment is due. I'm talking about multi-billion-dollar corporations whose software is their product. Now, one thing you need to understand about computers today is that the hardware we use is insanely fast. The CPU, which you can think of as the brain of the computer, is capable of doing trillions of instructions per second. If you use computers correctly, you can hook up 10 players around the world onto a network with almost no delay. You can compute complicated physics. You can render beautiful 3D graphics to a screen, and you can do all of this 60 times per second. However, when I opened up Microsoft PowerPoint to put this presentation together, it took 6 seconds to load text and images onto a screen. When I use Microsoft Teams to communicate with my colleagues and I need to scroll up to see what was said yesterday, it takes seconds for that text to load. And then even though my machine has gigabytes of memory available, when I scroll back to the present conversation, it needs to reload that text again. Twitter is an application whose primary focus is to display 280 character long text messages, and yet on your smartphone it's often clunky and unresponsive. Now keep in mind the smartphone in your pocket is at least 1 million times faster than the Apollo guidance computer that was used to land people safely on the moon. Now call me crazy, but I really don't think that Twitter is more complex than landing people safely on the moon. So the point I'm trying to make here is that software is unacceptably slow. To give some scale of how slow it is, imagine if you walk into McDonald's to order your favorite fast food, and it takes literal years for the order to be complete. So how did software end up this slow? Well, we as a tech society made it so. How? Well, there are many reasons, but I think the primary reason is because we shifted our focus away from problem solving towards searching for solutions. You know, as a society, we tend to Google things, and programmers are no different. An average programmer's workflow when they're doing something that isn't particularly novel, but like a routine day job, is they'll write some code, and they'll make a mistake because mistakes happen, and they'll get some indecipherable error message that they don't understand. And because they don't understand it, the natural thing to do is to copy and paste it into Google and see what comes up. And they'll invariably end up on some question answering website. The classical question answering website for programmers is called Stack Overflow. And either they'll find that their question has been asked before, or they'll ask their question, and somebody else will post some code that claims to solve their problem. Now, quite often it doesn't quite, but the programmer will copy and paste that code, see that it works, and then just move on. Minimal effort, maximum reward. Most importantly, nobody's reinventing the wheel here. But the problem with this is that the code that the programmer copy-pasted very often also copy-pasted code from somewhere else, and so on, kind of like forming a pyramid scheme of code. And then you can end up with this kind of monstrosity. This hugely complex code base is tasked with storing a single number in a database. Now, the yellow box that's highlighted points to the single line of code that actually does this job, and the rest is just copy and paste nonsense that actually doesn't need to be there. So why do we need all these lines of code? And more importantly, who on the planet can possibly understand all of it? If you take somebody else's code that you don't understand and use it to solve the problem that you also don't understand, you actually make your problem more complicated, not less. Also, copy and paste like this can cause you to depend on code that you don't even need, and the results can be disastrous. So here's a really funny story. In 2016, a programmer deleted some of his code off the internet, and it caused millions of websites around the world to crash, including prominent ones like Facebook. Now, you might think that this code would have implemented something very complex and critical. But in reality, the code, which is simply 11 lines, merely puts spaces on the left-hand side of text in order to align it properly. Somehow, millions of websites around the world had come to depend on this very trivial piece of code that could easily be done in a single day by a competent developer, all because we were too lazy to reinvent the wheel. And the most infuriating part about this is that even with dependency on this piece of code, many websites still fail to pad the left-hand side of their text correctly. It's mad. The point is, when somebody packages something and hands it to you and says, don't reinvent the wheel, use this, it's usually not a wheel. But in order to understand how it's not a wheel, let's have a look at what a wheel is. A wheel is often obvious in hindsight. It's simple, it's maintainable, it's replaceable, and solves a very specific problem, and it's also context dependent. If your road happens to be made out of half cylinders, then the optimal wheel shape is actually a square, not a circle. But you can arrive at the square wheel from the circular wheel through a simple iterative design process. Now, you'll notice that none of these things are present, none of these characteristics are present in software. Blind reuse of code and information retrieval leads to the creation of extremely fragile and complex systems that can break at any time. And if you take this and try to use it to solve your specific problem, the only way to get that to work is to hack something on top of it and add millions more lines of code. And that's why things like OpenRice take ages to load text and images about a restaurant. Now, I get it. Sometimes you're in a time crunch and you just need to get your product out as soon as you can. But for all the other times, there really is no substitute for really sitting down and understanding your problem and also understanding the tools that you're going to use to solve that problem. And if the tool that you need doesn't actually exist, you need to go and build that tool yourself. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about programming and code, but the fundamental idea that underlies everything and applies to all fields is this. Focus on solving your problem and understanding your problem, and don't focus on looking for ready-made solutions. And this is true even in the arts. The painter understands which paintbrush they want to use, not because they know trivial details about the construction of that paintbrush, but because they have an idea of the artistic expression they want to put on the canvas. The composer understands which instruments to use in their composition, not because they are well versed in the engineering of that instrument, but because they have a good idea of the musical expression they wish to tell people. Be especially wary when somebody hands you something that they claim will solve your problem, and only use it if you understand your problem and you understand the thing that's being handed to you. And honestly, if your objective is to learn and understand, which as a student it should be, then even if the perfect tool already exists for your problem, you should reinvent it anyways, because that's one of the best ways to truly understand what you're dealing with. It will help you to learn and understand far more effectively than if you just took the tool and used it. So the next time somebody tells you, don't reinvent the wheel, feel free to ask them, what wheel? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for the insightful speech. I'm sure many of us will now learn to focus on problem solving rather than Googling information in the future.
Let us introduce our next speech, Who's Watching Us? Why Privacy Matters by our very own speaker, Aishwarya. After attending the Global Summit on Data Privacy just a few months ago, Aishwarya found that there was much more to privacy policies than meets the eye.
Her speech outlines what corporations truly do with our intellectual property, whilst debunking common myths surrounding privacy in general. Stay tuned.
When's the last time you read the terms and conditions of a digital service? How about acknowledging an app's privacy policy? For most of you, scrolling down as fast as you can to the checkbox at the end of a form is something you do without thinking. And it certainly was for me, until I learned what it actually meant for my data. We're treating the terms and conditions simply as an obligatory checkbox at the end of a form we've hardly read, as opposed to treating it like the legally binding contract it truly is. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to talk about data privacy. It's an internet buzzword that's been thrown around with the likes of AI, machine learning, and big data. But by definition, data privacy, or information privacy, is a branch of security concerned with the proper handling of data, consent, notice, and regulatory obligations. In an entirely digitized 21st century, you'd even be right to equate the value of data to liquid gold. Now, debates around privacy usually seem simple at first. Something is either private or it's not. But it's not until we unpack the fine print that we realize why it's so important. Before we even delve into my personal experiences with privacy, we need to first understand the principle that content on the World Wide Web is hardly unintentional. There's a hidden goal driving the direction of all the technology we make, and that goal is the race for our attention. Because every news site, TED Talk, elections, politicians, games, even meditation apps have to compete for one thing, which is our attention. And there's only so much of it. And the best way to get people's attention is to know how someone's mind works. In other words, discussions about privacy are more central to our daily lives than we can possibly imagine. 6 months ago, I participated in the Global Summit on Data Security. As a student, it was fairly intimidating listening to large corporations and thought leaders devoting their lives as well as resources aimed at producing solutions to privacy concerns. the summit, without a doubt, was memorable. I was exposed to a plethora of think tanks, forcing me to reflect upon countless security breaches occurring on a day-to-day basis that I had hardly ever given a single thought to. But what I learned from the summit goes far beyond saving passwords and the do's and don'ts of social media. Something that really resonated with me to this day is an abbreviation known as the 3 P's of privacy: people, purpose, and process. The first of the P's is people. As a thought experiment, I was tasked with utilizing common conceptions about privacy to convince a group of selected individuals towards purchasing a set product. You'll be surprised to see how easy this was. To prove just how few people bother to read the terms and conditions when they purchase an item or engage a service, we succeeded in persuading 99% of survey respondents and customers at the summit to surrender ridiculous things, like the naming rights of their firstborn child and browsing history access to their mothers. As a matter of fact, those who had provided seemingly innocuous information, such as their zip code or travel preferences, were 10 times more likely to buy a predetermined product. Let that sink in for a second. 99 of every 100 participants are willingly surrendering their personal intellectual property to profit-driven companies, potentially subjecting themselves to sneakily targeted advertisements. For what it's worth, corporations could even advertise bottled air within a privacy policy agreement, and I'd expect the majority of you to go along with it without even noticing. Next, purpose. To identify how exactly corporations make money off of our data, it's worth breaking down what a privacy policy looks like in the first place. We've all wondered what those endless pages of clauses and exceptions actually mean for you as a user. And at the summit, we formulated a general template based on over 150 policies accused of security breaches. Almost every one of these statements starts off generic, citing company values and the usual "privacy is at the forefront of our business" statement. It's the first thing you see, and so needs to be able to make you trust the company enough to skim read the rest of the agreement. Unsurprisingly, the data we collected showed that 98% of users effectively check the "I agree" box based off the first 3 lines of the agreement. Following the value statement comes the ask, a section strategically concealed and devised ultimately to list your rights and data taken, but unfortunately isn't really intended for you to read. Statements you would most definitely object to, like the sharing of your credit card data across company branches, and the usage of your location for predictive adverts, are stored here. Take a look at this statement from Amazon's privacy policy. Notice anything yet? By ticking that agree box, Amazon's users have literally placed their banking information in the hands of 150 of Amazon's subsidiary companies. Simply by ordering that set of headphones online, over 350,000 employees have just received access to your data. With lengthy technical jargon and promise statements, you're confused into thinking these are there to inform users, as opposed to protecting companies instead. If there's anything you take away from this speech, it's to look through the second half of the privacy agreement for every digital service you use. Chances are there's a box you'd rather uncheck that's getting overlooked. And if you do end up checking that box, I'd make sure you're happy with a minimum of 10,000 complete strangers looking through that information. Finally, the last of the P's is process. Many of the companies cited updated regulations and newly processed policies as a means of producing solutions to privacy concerns. This got me thinking, what is this actually going to change? How many of us are going to scroll through the new policies and alter our data settings? We sign up to get the service, but we don't put much thought into who might be storing our clicks. It does seem weird at first when the device seems to know where we live, how old we are, what brand of toothpaste we use, or what books we like. Then we grow to expect this familiarity, and even to like it. It makes the online world seem customized for us, and it cuts down on the time we need to map the route home or order something new to read. The machine essentially anticipates what we want. This, ladies and gentlemen, forms the foundation of predictive analytics. Now, some of you here might be wondering, if I've got nothing to hide, why should I care? And if you are, I wouldn't be surprised. In fact, we dedicated an entire day of the summit towards evaluating what's known as the nothing to hide argument. Essentially, in a tight nutshell, the theory states that an individual has no reason to fear or oppose surveillance programs unless they are afraid it will uncover their own illegal activities. But it's equally important to take a step back and understand the wider implications of this. Over the next decade, the next 3 billion people will come online, mostly from developing countries. Personal privacy will be vital to ensuring their survival, both offline and online. Even if we do opt out, as corporations suggest, does this really mean they stop collecting our data? Would they reveal collected data to us? And if we ask to have this data deleted, would they actually do so? In my eyes, arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different than saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. And the internet, it's the very epitome of free speech. As such, we need to make privacy ubiquitous, simple, and understood by all. Only then will we be able to preserve one of the greatest innovations of the last century, the internet, and allow for our world to continue to develop, innovate, and prosper. Browsing the internet under the privacy of our homes has given us the impression that our activities are also private, but often we're more visible than ever. In short, ladies and gentlemen, the next time you download an application and the terms and conditions pop up, be someone who is responsible with their data and will refuse to walk willingly into a trap a company has so craftily laid out. Because data is now an invaluable economic resource. And if we want to allow for the internet to drive the benefits of every aspect of life it permeates through today, we need to stand up to the challenge of protecting our data. In turn, rebooting our digital conscience. Thank you.
Thank you, Aishwarya, for your speech. It was undoubtedly eye-opening, especially as someone who had limited knowledge on data privacy policies previously.
I agree, but there's more to come. Our next speaker will talk about the education system and how we can help students to thrive, not just survive. After being in a mindless education system that emphasizes success through standardized testing, Toby has realized that current education needs a reform, first and foremost by recognizing that each individual is unique.
Toby's speech is a short glance into why and how we can improve the system for future generations to come. Let us give a virtual round of applause for Toby.
How can students regain faith in themselves? I believe that every child has the potential to become self-confident. Yet, as we have grown older, I find that we might have been let down by the people around us, losing that innate faith in ourselves. When I was younger, I remember myself as being inherently curious. Starting from the age of 4, I was interested in anything to do with the weather. During the summer months, I would track the exact positions of the typhoons in the South China Sea on a whiteboard, while time seemed to stop still in the process. In those early days, self-confidence came naturally to me, like a fish to water, because every time I learned something new, I gained confidence in my own abilities. I could fully engage myself in whatever I was learning without the fear of making a mistake or feeling the pressure to achieve beyond my peers. The freedom to learn was in my own hands, and it felt exhilarating. I was introduced to chess, my next hobby, which was chess, through a stack of chess trophies besides the school's entrance on my primary school, which is Koi Bay. Once I started playing, I realized that chess was an inherently competitive game. You either win against your opponent or you lose against them. And draws were usually few and far between. Not long after, I joined my first tournament, where I was squarely beaten. On one hand, I loved learning chess and learning how the pieces worked. But on the other, I felt the pressure to achieve better and better results in my tournaments, and I felt the pressure, and I wondered if I could continue achieving these achievements without losing my self-esteem. Fast forward to year 7, where after years of relentless bullying, both inside and outside of school, my self-esteem was shattered. At that time, I was desperately searching for validation from my peers, and academics was how I set out to achieve that. I was deeply afraid if someone would point out a mistake in my working, and I remember throwing my book against the wall. In frustration and anguish, I defined myself as being an achiever, being top of the class, and I felt the burden from my classmates to be this way. I had tied academics to my self-esteem. I had tied it to my identity and never let it go because I was deeply afraid inside. My pursuit for academic achievement only intensified when the IGCSE exam results were released every year. I remember how I'd see the faces of the top achievers achieving 9 A stars or 10 A stars or even more. And there was a huge acknowledgement of how far they had come in achieving these results. I had always aspired to be like them, but when I finally received my IGCSE grades, I was proud of the 9 A stars and 1 grade 8 that I had received. However, my insecurities continued to remain with me throughout my time in school. Inside of me was still that hard shell, which I would not let anyone see. And inside of that dark place, I hid my deepest vulnerabilities and fears. But that was slowly beginning to change thanks to some lucky encounters I had with a few teachers who not only actively supported me, but believed in my potential to grow. Thanks to a chance encounter, I got to know Eddie Wu, a math teacher who broadcasts his lessons online on YouTube. I was struck by how he developed a personal rapport with each and every one of his students. He encouraged the brightest to produce the best work, but also provided a safe, calm, and nurturing environment for the most disadvantaged students, such as those facing drug addiction or domestic violence in their home lives. And there, I saw how a teacher could develop a relationship with each one of their students. And I believe that teachers inspire and look for the best rather than the worst in every student, fostering a healthy relationship that will continue for a lifetime. That was eventually how I learned to love myself again, through that support that only a teacher can give. What I now want to turn everyone's attention to is the countless other students who have faced similar disadvantages, being emotionally left behind due to a lack of support from the people who should be at the center of their lives. Every day at school, I see sleep-deprived students who often become sullen and moody, unable to concentrate in class, because on the one hand, the school timetable expects them to be awake, whereas the body clock expects them to be still asleep. I see students with special needs being looked down upon when they ask for extra time in their exams. And I fear most for the students who are left behind in the margins and ostracized due to their emotional outbursts, when in reality, they may be hiding a deep history of trauma and of pain, but just can't find someone who is willing to listen to their story. After facing a long history of trauma and being lucky enough to meet the right people who are willing to believe in me, I wondered, how can I give back? How can I do the same that others have done for me? That opportunity came during work experience in year 11, where I met a group of adults with special needs. In particular, I remember one student called Jeremy, who would always hug students in his arms without any warning. At first, I was intimidated by him because I felt uncomfortable by how he acted. But then I realized that he was just like me, that he too needed love and support, and wasn't quite sure how to express that feeling towards others. On the last day, when we were singing Christmas carols in front of the public, I saw how Jeremy was laughing and smiling while he sang. And it was that moment that I realized that I had made a difference, and had given back to someone who was desperately in need, allowing them to, in turn, give back to others who need that same support, and spreading messages of hope. Reciprocating from others has truly changed my perspective on how I view the world and how it can help others in future. I'd like to sum all this up with a concept called Ikigai from Japanese, which translates as a reason for being. It encapsulates what you're good at, what you can earn a living from, and most importantly, what can help both others and yourself. And that's the passion, mission, and vocation all rolled into one. I believe this is that motivation to actively make a difference to other people. And that's also how we can reboot our conscience, by doing the right thing and helping other people in need. To all those who experience trauma, I'd like to tell you, you are not alone. Although it may be difficult, there's always someone waiting for you. And it's always possible to find that someone who's going to trust you, and in turn, to regain trust in yourself. Remember, all of you have the power to help someone in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, for your speech. As a student, it is easy to blame the education system rather than thinking about possible ways to improve it.
And on the same theme, social media has become an integral part of students' lives to the point where some even see it as a double-edged sword. Our next speaker, Akru, gives us a thorough insight into the dichotomy of social media in her speech.
Through her personal journey of discovering the narrowing effect of social media, and more specifically its automated algorithms, she will lead us through how we can take advantage of the power of social media to educate ourselves and enforce change in the world.
So without further ado, let us welcome Aku and her speech, The Dichotomy of Social Media.
I come from a family of doctors, a family where the status quo is fiercely apolitical, a family where the expected response is to simply smile and nod on the rare occasion that politics are even discussed. My family is one that fits the cookie-cutter image of doctors who are compassionate and empathetic, liberal even, yet believe in the antiquated saying that doctors should always be neutral. Additionally, I come from an oxymoron of a city, incredibly diverse but chooses to sweep delicate issues under the rug. A city that welcomes all cultures but encourages conformity. Growing up, my sister and I were taught to be kind and to feel for others. If someone drops something on the street, pick it up and give it back to them. Be grateful for what you have, because there are children in the world who don't even have enough food to survive. On the flip side, we were also taught not to comment on sensitive topics such as racism and sexism. At the time, I was a precocious child with a big mouth who was confused as to why I couldn't run my mouth to my heart's desire. As I grew older, though, I began to understand that the emphasis on remaining silent was a way our parents felt they could shield us from the harsher side of the world and prevent us from alienating ourselves in a society that I still believe wasn't particularly progressive. To place us in a bubble, if you will. So like any kid who just wanted to please people and fit in somehow, I followed along and I chose to accept the everyday discrimination as something that was unavoidable, unchangeable. I would listen to the arguments from both sides about race and gender and sexuality and class, but told myself to not form any of my own opinions, to remain neutral. In my pursuit of neutrality, however, I became passive. I lost belief in the power that we have as individuals to create change in the world, and started to think that maybe this is just the way the world works. Maybe there really isn't anything I can do. Amidst this all, there was always this other part of my brain that was like a raging storm of emotion in the carefully calibrated calm of logic. You see, I've always been someone who felt absolutely everything, especially when I was younger. Seriously, I think I cried constantly. I felt big emotions for myself and even bigger ones for others. But as a consequence of my rule-loving, system-following nature, I never let this part of myself dominate my mind. I learned to first act rationally and logically. I distinctly remember overhearing some derogatory comments made by a few middle-aged women that were aimed at a same-sex couple that I knew. Instead of speaking out for people that I knew, I filled my water bottle and I walked away. I was enraged, but it was almost as if I had conditioned myself to hold my tongue and put away my inner disapproval. Who was I to judge? This mindset of passive disagreement carried on digitally as well. I would avoid posts that were even the slightest bit controversial, staying clear of anything that my 14-year-old self deemed too political. Consequently, the algorithms used in social media presented me with posts and information that painted the world in an illusion of unicorns and rainbows, which only worked to reinforce the habits and behaviors that I already had. Later on, as I was fresh into drowning myself in IB psychology, I learned that these algorithms are a form of what social psychologists call gatekeeping. In a nutshell, a gatekeeper is a person, group of people, or automated algorithm that works to filter out information. In their most innocent form, these algorithms provide you with information that social media companies deem you would most enjoy seeing. However, the fact that they do this can have a negative and narrowing effect on your perspective. When you are constantly surrounded by information that simply verifies your existing beliefs and doesn't push you to see beyond your bubble, social media can become a source of confirmation bias and blind you to the realities and discriminations in the world. So fast forward a year or two to the end of 2019, and I had finally decided to embrace the part of my brain that was outraged at discrimination. I found my way into learning more about injustices around the world by taking a deep dive into gender inequality and sexism, and began to fully realize that there was so much more injustice happening both in bright daylight, but also in between the lines. It was this shift in my mindset that irreversibly changed the way social media affected my perspective. I remember YouTube kept recommending these videos to me from this channel called Jubilee, in the sea of sports videos that the algorithm usually gave me. So one day I decided to quench my curiosity and I watched one. It was part of their Middle Ground series, and that particular video was a discussion where people who were pro and anti-vaccine came together to put forth their perspectives. After 14 minutes and 20 seconds passed in the blink of an eye, I became nearly addicted to these videos. I always went into a video with a firm perspective of my own, so it wasn't that any of the videos changed my opinion on a particular subject. It was that they taught me to listen and to see something from the other side of the table. By listening to people who thought vastly differently than I did, I was able to flip my world upside down and better understand where other people were coming from, finding reason in their arguments as well. More importantly, it started to erase my trepidation of looking into injustices that don't necessarily affect me. And it forced me to see the fact that even injustices that don't affect me are my problem too. Because at the end of the day, we're all human. How could I want equality for myself, but not for the person next to me? Last summer, the power of social media reached an entirely new height. The Black Lives Matter movement confronted everyone with the harsh truth of systemic racism in American legal systems, healthcare systems, and in the country itself. Social media was at the root of the uproar and was a key platform in uniting the world and in helping people educate themselves. Additionally, it was instrumental in showing support because we will never understand without having lived the lives of the men and women who face racism every single day. But we can show solidarity and use the voices that we have to advocate for those who don't have a voice. The united front shown partly through social media and the pressure from that platform was the driving force behind real change and reform. I'll admit, the overly cautious mindset I had still lingers with me to this day. I had wanted to speak out against the still present discrimination against women in the workplace, or the violence against people of color in the US, but I saw the posts that were getting reposted time and time again on Instagram stories and thought, maybe this is too performative. I debated writing an article about the sexism that is weaved into Hong Kong culture, and how in 2021, over 50% of employers still would not hire women with children, while the mentality that men make better leaders is ever present. But yet again, I doubted myself. I doubted whether I knew enough to voice my opinion, whether I was good enough at writing to articulate my thoughts, whether anyone would even read or care about what I had to say. However, this was the chance that I couldn't turn down. It saddens me that there are people I know to this day who have a perspective that is degrading and discriminatory to people who are different to them. So I'm standing here today asking you to broaden your horizons, to widen your perspective. Change is difficult. Self-reflection, recognizing discriminatory views in ourselves, calling out friends and family. Those are all incredibly hard to do. I get it. So let's take advantage of social media and take a risk to reboot our conscience. As they say, we are the leaders of tomorrow, but that's simply not enough anymore. We need to become the change makers of today, pushing change and progression. We need to have the tough conversations. It's simply not good enough to be not racist, not sexist, or not homophobic. We must become anti-racism, anti-sexism, and anti-homophobia. We have this incredible platform of social media that allows us to reach people in every corner of the world, a power that those before us didn't possess. So it's time to use that platform to burst the bubble. The world is watching. What are you going to do?
Thank you, Aki, for your speech. Let us use social media positively to spread awareness to situations where we best support those who are less fortunate than us.
Definitely. Our next speaker, Vincent, thinks that it is easy to perceive ourselves as primary givers of help and judge others, causing us to view the world through a narrow and limited perspective.
Having led many mission trips in the past, Vincent will be speaking about how he and many others are learning to overcome this by adopting the learner's mindset. By becoming more compassionate towards others, we can facilitate opportunities in the midst of impossibility and bring about long-term sustainable changes in our communities and beyond.
So now, let us welcome Vincent to enhance our understanding of this learner's mindset.
In 2015, I took a team of people to Smoky Mountain in Tondo, Philippines for some poverty relief work. Now, why is it called Smoky Mountain, you may ask? Smoky Mountain is not just a normal mountain. It's a mountain that's literally built by tons of rubbish. As a result of the strong heat in the Philippines, the flammable substance in the rubbish had caught on fire many times in the past, evolving large buildup of smoke into the air. When I first arrived there, I was extremely uncomfortable with the strong and unpleasant smell of the rubbish. It felt like I was in a giant dumpster. I was simply shocked by how irresponsible the government had been in taking care of the basic living need of the local people there, and how such a place can still exist in a modern world today. And to many people in this area, this home. For us, we may see it as an environment which clearly lacks cleanliness. But for many locals, this is a place of financial opportunity. Over the past decade, the local community survived there by scavenging around Smoky Mountain every day with the hope of finding something valuable in the midst of the rubbish to resell them and to maintain their living. One day, our team went there for food distribution. As soon as we shout, "Food is ready," out of the corner of my eye, there was something coming out from the pile of rubbish. It was a little girl who was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. She slowly crawled out and walked to us for food. And my heart was completely broken when I saw this. Seeing her being surrounded by tons of dirty rubbish and imagining how difficult her life must be, I immediately went up to her and carried her and used what I had to clean her face and gave her some food. that night, I could not stop thinking about that little girl. I kept asking myself repeatedly, what more can I do to get her out from that current situation she's in? After all, I cannot imagine her world would have any joy, happiness, or hope at all. So then I start to think, what are perhaps some of the resources that I can provide to get her out from that terrible environment? As such, the next day I communicate with the local leader all these ideas and plans that I have to help improve the community. However, with these suggestions, I have made one grave mistake. I held the assumption that these people do not in any way experience love or care. And I was wrong. To my surprise, the local leader told me that despite the hardship they were encountering, this seemingly hopeless environment was actually filled with a palpable sense of community. The locals looked after one another, allowing this place to flourish with the many genuine relationships they have formed. While helping people that are less fortunate than us, how easy is it that we associate what we see with our own personal perspective, and to see the world through this somewhat narrow and limited perspective of ours? With the suggestion that I offered to that committee in the past, I realized that they missed the inclusion of the local people's feelings, the dream and the desire they hope to achieve for themselves. I enforced my personal perspective onto them to create false assumptions on their life, and had wrongly assumed that my ideas would be the best for them in that situation. Therefore, in fact, good intention can sometimes lead to bad outcomes. A couple that I know through charity work had decided to move to the Philippines a few years ago to look after one of the children they quickly became attached to on their previous mission trip. But to their surprise, the child actually rejected them when they returned for the second time. This because at the span of the time when they were away from the Philippines, this little child was constantly visited by different charity groups. And these people would visit her, and this child would feel a strong sense of affection. But what many people fail to notice is when these people left, this girl has a growing feeling of being repeatedly abandoned by people who love her. When we use our own perspective to judge, at best, we are only bringing people to our own standard, the standard that's subjectively acceptable to our eyes. Unconsciously, we start placing people into this box, which I call the box of limitation, and fall into a trap of having a given mindset. With the given mindset, we feel as though we are the primary giver of help, and only we can decide whether the method of help we can offer are two options, possible or impossible. But many people fail to notice is when we place people into the box of limitation, we also place ourselves in it. In the same way we limit other people's growth, we also limit our own growth. We stop improving ourselves because we are just so comfortable with our own standard. But do you know what is next to the box of limitation? It's the box of possibility. People who carry this recognize the importance of empowerment, opening their heart to others, and to maintain the humbleness and openness needed to learn from the things and people around them. With this learner mindset, it enables us to be compassionate and be in a variety of positions to promote the growth of people. But more importantly, it allows us to create possibility in the midst of impossibility. But of course, in the fast-paced society that we're living in today, many people actually prefer the given mindset rather than the learner mindset. It's because it gives us a sense of power and authority, that we are in control and other people should be listening to us. But just think about if we can all focus on the learner mindset, how much more potential we can all have to create long-term impact, which is undoubtedly more constructive for the community that we help with. Today, even though there are some major changes to my career, as I'm now involved in a full-time PhD research in the area of science and religion. The calling of serving others still remains as a central pillar in my family. I'm extremely fortunate to be married with someone who shares this exact same passion with me. My wife, Zoe, she is a Christian missionary with Youth with a Mission, YWAM Gateway, a local organization that focuses on caring and taking care of the holistic need of the communities here in Hong Kong. So together with my wife and our children, we continue to actively reach out to those in need and make a difference in our communities and beyond. With the communities that I oversee, we focus on building interdependent relationships with the locals. After all, they are the only one who can make consistent contribution to their communities while we are miles away in Hong Kong. We focus on the learner mindset to understand their situation from their perspective and to partner with them in ways that are suitable to their own unique circumstances. We regularly check on how they're doing to support and encourage them to continue. And this allows much more long-lasting and sustainable impact to the communities that we help. So today, I challenge you to think about how you're going to lose your mindset and to give way to the learner mindset which I previously mentioned. Do not be quick to impose your own personal perspective onto others, but take the time to understand them. Only then can we all continue to expand ourselves to foster the growth in other people, but also in our own personal life. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, for your speech. Truly, good intentions may not always lead to the greatest benefit if we don't consider others' perspectives.
On the other side of the story, we are honored to be able to invite Kathana to share her experiences during the Cambodian Civil War when the Khmer Rouge took over in 1975. Life for Kathana was fun and free until she was about 8 years old. All of a sudden, she felt that she had to grow up suddenly when Cambodia faced the Civil War.
In Kathana's speech, what I believe to be the key to my survival, she'll be sharing her childhood experiences and overcoming life's challenges and obstacles. Let us welcome Kathana.
Hello everyone. Some of you may already know that I am an SIS parent. My son Alexander Hankins, who is currently in year 13, and Netra Hankins graduated from South Island in 2019. The question is, why am I here today? I am here at my children's request. For my children today, I would like to share with you some part of my story, and especially to share with you what my dad said to me, which I believe it was the key to my survival, and it remained as a valuable lesson in my life. I was born in Cambodia. As a child, I was very lucky to live a very fortunate life. I was surrounded by big family. Life was fun and free back then until I was about 8. On the morning of 17th of April 1975, that was the morning that my fairy tale's life was turned into something unimaginable. It was the day that the whole country of Cambodia was taken over by the Communist Party revolution called Khmer Rouge. Everyone in the capital city of Phnom Penh was forced to evacuate, leaving all their belongings behind and travel by foot to the outside the city. And all we was told that we would return after 3 days. But that 3 days turned into 3 years, 8 months and 20 days of living in the countryside and working on the collective farm. During those years, children were separated from their parents. Many people were killed, tortured, and one of them was my dad. When I was about 10, it's time for me to leave the family cottage to join the labor camp. I was scared because a year earlier, when my older sister and my brother left home to the labor camp, we never seen or heard from them since. So the morning that someone came to take me away, I wanted to cry, but I knew that I shouldn't, nor should my parents, because we all had been educated that children was the property of Angkar, which what the Khmer Rouge called the government. So the children should only listen and give their devotion to Angkar only. So instead of giving a physical affection, my dad leaned forward to my ear and said, "Just be useful." And that was it. While I was walking to the camp, I kept thinking about what my dad said and what it meant. After walking all day through the villages, through the field, through the jungle, over a mountain, we arrived at the labor camp where I could stay close to my big sister for a while. There was no training period for any new kids. There is no time to walk, but to run. No time for trying, but just do it. If you try your best and was not good enough, you had better figure it out fast. Why was that not good enough like everybody else? There was punishment for working too slow, for complaining, for carelessness, forgetfulness. Life was terrible, miserable, painful, more than I could cope with. And I said to myself, what my dad said did not help at all. On one rainy evening, after working and get bitten by sandbug for hours in the rye fields, I was wet and cold, and I had no dry clothes to change into. And while I was trying to get warm and to dry my clothes that I was wearing, and I saw some rye cracker that partly burned, but they looked so inviting, and I was so hungry. So what my dad said to me suddenly popped in my mind. So I thought, if I help the cook fan the stove to get the flames going, since that seemed to be the problem, then the cook may reward me those rye cracker. So I did. I had learned how to rearrange the firewood from the girl in the village. And I did get the flame going, and I did get some of those rye crackers for dinner. Within a few months of standing in the mud for at least 8 hours a day, my feet got infected. Without any medication, it got to the point that I could not walk to the rice field. So I had to stay with the sick people where my feet got treated in the warm tamarind leaf water solution. But the price that I had to pay for not being able to work in the rice field, it was the bowls of rice. My feet got improved, but not good enough to get back to work in the fields yet. When some of the sick was taken away during the night, I got really worried. And the feelings that I could be next and my parents did not even know anything about it, it terrifies me more than the bowls of rice. So again, I thought about what my dad had said and looked for a way to be useful. So I asked the nurse if I can help her to distribute bowl of porridge to the very sick patient To my relief, she agreed. She was very happy that I helped her with that duty twice a day, but I still could not get the bolt of rice back yet. Then I saw some elderly people binding straw for making houses. So I asked if I could do that between sewing meal to patients and soaking my feet. From then on, I learned how to bind straw, look after baby while the mothers was working in the fields. I was very happy that I could get the bowl of rice back. More and more, I started to understand what being useful means, and so much that I want to go home and tell my dad. Not long after this, my sister was sent to a very far away camp, and I was moved as well to the children camp, which located even further away in the jungle, where the farmland was not cultivated yet. In the children camp, there was about 60 children, 4 adults and 1 grandpa, and we call him Grandpa Dum. One day when I was working on top of the hill next to Grandpa Dum, and I heard screaming, and I turned around to look, and there was 2 water buffalo just running fiercely towards Grandpa Dum and my direction. And Grandpa Dum lifted his hoe to scare them away, and he shouted demand for me to run for my life. I did not know how, but I fell face down on the ground. But I remember the feeling that the 8 buffalo feet just trampling on my back. When they had gone, Grandpa Dum turned me over. My clothes just stripped and torn, full of blood. And my right arm just dangling down when they lift me up. Thankfully, Grandpa Dum treated my wounds and my broken shoulder by himself in his cottage, preparing an organic remedy using papaya leaf, papaya fruit, and other ingredients, and the natural heat therapies. Slowly, I gradually recovered and was able to stand up with my arm in a sling. But I was not strong enough to go back to work in the field yet. With these constant fears of being useless and being rid of, I went to the kitchen to see what I could do with one hand. So I fanned the fire, picked up fruit and vegetables, helped to prepare food, and above all, I learned by observing how to cook rice for 65 people in a giant wok. After my recovery, working in the kitchen became my full-time job. Since I have learned so much, and the cook found that I was useful to have around. There was many incidents in those years that I almost died. From drowning, sickness of malaria, and starvation, etc. What happened in those 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days had taken away so much from our life that some prefer not to look back. But to me, there have been so many occasions in life that I remind myself of what I had been through and appreciate what I have learned from it. Dear everyone, although this war happened so many years ago, the word that my dad had whispered in my ear the day that I was taken away is still ingrained in my mind today. Just be useful. Be useful to yourself. Make effort to learn basic necessary skills in life. whether that be making food, cleaning up your own room, sewing by hand, or use sewing machine. After all, you will never know when you will need it in the future. Be useful to your family. Be aware of your family situation, whether that be physically, mentally, or financially. Offer help and understanding wherever you can. Only with this, you can extend your usefulness to your community, your country, and so on. Today, I still finding way to improve myself, to continue to learn new way of making different kind of food to make myself useful in order to support my family. I find way to be useful to our community in Hong Kong. I have joined and donate whatever I can to help those that are homeless in Hong Kong as a result from the current pandemic. All I wish to say is, you don't have to go through a war to learn how to survive. And you don't have to go through a dramatic life experience to start realizing that you are the person who can make and shape your own path. Life itself is a battle. You shouldn't have to wait until it is too late to realize that making yourself useful, regardless of context, is important at all stages in life. So, go forth and be useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathana, for your heartfelt speech. It was incredibly insightful to learn about your experiences. I believe our audiences felt the same way whilst hearing your speech and would definitely remember your father's advice. Just be useful.
I can't agree more. Unfortunately, our event is coming to an end, and our last speech is by Thomas, who will talk about his findings whilst writing his first song.
In his speech, he reflects on his experiences and progress, how he has been able to grow as a person and apply it to other areas of his life. Through his speech, he hopes to be able to share that creative spark with you.
And in fact, Thomas will also be performing his song later on. So this is now welcome our final speaker for this year's event, Thomas Hafner.
Should high school students be taught how to be creative? What does it mean to be creative in the first place? In this day and age, I believe an increasingly important skill for everyone is creativity. Every day, we students face pressures to achieve in academics, to maintain our social lives, to maintain our social media profiles, and to face the anxiety of living during a global pandemic. Setting time aside to be creative is one thing we could try to do to escape from these pressures. Over the past few months, one of the things that I myself tried to do was to get creative. Over the journey of writing my first song, I began to wonder about what creativity truly means, rebooting my previous perception of the topic. Why is it that time always seems to pass instantly when we're creating something new? What happens in our brains when we're being creative? And when else do we use creativity in our daily life? If there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, it's that we don't simply use our knowledge to be creative. We also use our intuition. That is to say, we think in a range of different ways. In preparation for this presentation, I did some research about creativity, and I'll try to answer that question that I asked earlier. Creativity is our ability to be imaginative and inventive. An interesting distinction that I learned about was between convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is our ability to use analytical reasoning to find the single correct solution to a problem. and it's associated with intelligence. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, is our ability to come up with rich ideas and original thoughts. We associate this with creativity. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been doing something and been so totally engaged, engrossed, and focused on it to the point where hours just seem to fly by? Well, a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote about this feeling, which he called flow, that people often feel when being creative. It's when you're so immersed in something that you totally forget about everything else around you. The stresses of everyday life, the sights and sounds of the environment you're in, and even the passage of time all disappear. This could be through doing music, writing, sports, scientific experiments, and more. By reaching this flow state, people often feel more motivated and satisfied. I experienced this feeling when I was working alongside a musical friend on a section of the song, and I felt a complete escape from everyday life. So, how does all of this work out in real life? My creative process shows how convergent thinking, divergent thinking, and flow come together. I began after I was inspired after a jazz piano lesson. I created a bass line. Then I thought that was pretty good, so I added some chords on top of it. And finally, I added a drum beat to pull it all together. I was excited. Later that week, I taught my bandmates the different parts, and when I heard everything linking in together, it was the most satisfying feeling in the world. What did I learn from doing this? Divergent thinking, being creative, is satisfying. I definitely felt a sense of flow while playing with my bandmates, and I always looked forward to continuing working on the song in my spare time. Later, when I was trying to come up with a melody for the song, I brainstormed as many ideas as I could, but I was completely and utterly stuck. Nothing I was playing sounded right. Curse you, writer's block! So I continued with my day, as one does, but then that night, just as I was trying to go to sleep, I was struck with the idea for what would end up becoming the final melody. While I was trying to sleep, lying in my bed, I grabbed my phone and recorded myself humming the melody so I wouldn't forget it the next day. This is when I learned yet another valuable lesson about creativity. You cannot force it. To bring everything together, I'll try to answer that question that I asked all the way at the beginning of the talk. Should high school students be taught how to be creative? My answer, in all facets of life, we students need to use different types of thinking to solve our problems. Convergent thinking versus divergent thinking. Knowledge versus intuition. Conscious versus unconscious. To prepare us to be successful, we should be learning in an environment that allows us to practice all types of thinking. Along the way, we might even find something that we're passionate about, too. With all of that in mind, take a listen to the song that I've been writing over the past few months.
Thank you, Thomas, for your speech and your song. I felt that really stimulated my creative instincts. With that being said, this is our last speech for the day, and I hope your conscience was rebooted through learning about our speaker's unique experiences and insights.
Before we end today's event, we'd like to thank our supervisor, Ms. Crouch, for your advice and guidance throughout. Abby, Angus, Daryl, and Jackie for sharing your technical expertise and advice on filming, stage, and lighting.
We would also like to express our gratitude for our speakers for preparing amazing speeches for us. We recognize your hard work and devotion throughout and are extremely thankful.
Thank you for our TEDxTSIS head team for your hard work over the past year. It was a pleasure working with you guys. We wish the Year 12's best of luck hosting the event next year and the Year 13 success in the IB exams coming up.
And last but not least, we would like to thank you for tuning into today's live stream. We hope you've enjoyed the speeches as much as we did and that you found something that resonated with you. Thank you once again, and we hope to see you in next year's event.